Hey guys! Welcome to Films Recapped. Today we have a sci-fi, horror thriller film from 2017 titled, Life. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and enjoy. The movie begins with a scene with an unmanned space probe, returning from Mars to the International Space Station. The mission was to collect a soil sample that might contain evidence of extraterrestrial life. The space probe is severely damaged as it passes through an asteroid field. The space station prepares for the arrival of the space probe traveling at a high speed. The crew aren't exactly trained for this scenario, but they need to align their space station to the trajectory of the space probe by controlling a huge robotic arm that is attached to the space station. Rory Adams prepares to perform a spacewalk while controlling the robotic arm, and it is all up to him to catch the space probe. The 6-member ISS crew successfully captures the spacecraft. One of the crew member, who is an exobiologist, Hugh Derry. He extracts soil sample from the land of Mars. He manages to retrieve an inactive cell from the sample. Upon examining it under the microscope, cells can be seen multiplying, but there is no movement or sign of life. The crew patiently waits for a positive outcome. Hugh tries different atmospheric conditions to revive it. After setting the atmospheric condition to prehistoric Earth, the microorganism moves. The team is the first to see a proof of life beyond Earth. There is a live stream telecast with Earth in celebration of the new form of life found. Ekaterina, the mission commander, and the team answer the questions of a few students from an American school. A student from an elementary school named the Martian organism, Calvin. Surprisingly, it quickly grows into a multi-celled organism that is able to have some form of interaction with Hugh. Everyone, especially Hugh, is very fascinated with the Martian organism. He spends more time learning and interacting with it. The organism too reacts with Hugh, forming some kind of connection. After an incident in the lab, Calvin becomes inactive. Hugh is blamed for not checking everything properly before exiting the lab. Dr. Miranda was somewhat relieved as she saw Calvin growing too fast. Hugh tries to revive Calvin with mild electric shocks, but Calvin immediately turns hostile and attacks him, crushing his hand in doing so. As Hugh loses his consciousness from Calvin's attack, Calvin breaks the electric shock tool to cut open the glove and escape from the enclosure. Now free in the lab, Calvin senses a lab rat in the enclosure beside and devours it entirely and grows in size. Meanwhile, without the commander's approval, flight engineer Rory Adams takes the opportunity to enter the lab and rescue Hugh. Rory manages to get Hugh to safety, however, Calvin latches onto his leg, leaving medical officer David Jordan no choice but to lock Rory in the lab to keep Calvin isolated. Rory accepts his fate and decides to fight off Calvin. He uses a flamethrower to attack Calvin but runs out of fuel soon and is unable to kill it. Calvin enters his mouth, slowly killing him by consuming his organs from the inside. As the flamethrower was floating around, it came close to the smoke detector, and the fire alarm went off. Calvin emerges from Rory's mouth even larger. The crew loses automatic control over the fire alarm system, and they have to manually shut off the fire control vent. They realize how smart Calvin is as it goes from one vent to another, trying to escape while the crew try to shut it off. However, Calvin manages to escape through the fire control vent before the crew could shut off all the vents. Hugh theorizes that the lack of breathable air on Mars is what kept the organism dormant. Ekaterina sends out a distress message to the control station Earth about the nature of Calvin, but the transmission gets cut off midway. Having all communications with Earth cut off, they found the issue to be due to the overheating of the communication systems. Ekaterina, being the most experienced, performs a spacewalk to fix the overheating. She considers a possibility that Calvin could have gotten into the cooling system as she notices scorching around the cooling valve. Calvin, having breached the cooling system, latches onto her and bursts her spacesuit's coolant system, resulting in toxic liquid filling her helmet. Calvin has now got hold of her leg. She struggles to get back into the ISS, but realizing that by doing so, risks Calvin into re-entering the space station. She refuses to assist David from opening the airlock, and stops him from doing so as well from the inside, keeping Calvin out of the station. She lets go off the station and eventually drowns in her spacesuit. As her body drifted away into space, Calvin managed to latch back onto the ISS. The crew realizes that the only way Calvin can enter the station is through the thruster opening. As Calvin attempts to enter through the opening, the crew uses the thrusters to prevent it from entering, but their attempts fail and the station loses too much fuel. The orbit of the ISS is altered and it enters a decaying orbit, which will eventually lead it to burn up in Earth's atmosphere. With limited fuel left, systems engineer Sho Murakami warns the crew that they need to use it to get back into a safe orbit, but this would allow Calvin back into the station. After getting back into safe orbit, the crew plans on making Calvin dormant by isolating themselves into one module and venting the atmosphere from the rest of the station. When Hugh enters cardiac arrest, they try to revive him by using a defibrillator. The crew notices movement around Hugh's lower body. Miranda zips open Hugh's suit and the crew were shocked to find that Calvin was feeding off Hugh's leg. Miranda uses the defibrillator on Calvin, only to draw its attention to the crew. Calvin has now grown into a larger tentacled creature. It goes on to attack the remaining crew. Sho separates himself from David and Miranda and seals himself in his sleeping pod. Calvin attempts to crack the glass and consume him but fails and moves away. Hugh dies soon after due to loss of blood. David and Miranda manage to track Calvin as it had consumed Hugh's marker off his leg. Hugh's corpse is set up as bait by David and Miranda to lure Calvin away from Sho and confine it in a module to deprive it of oxygen. Having received the disrupted distress message earlier, the control station on Earth sends out a Soyuz capsule. The crew notices the capsule nearing. David tries to alert the Soyuz capsule from docking as Calvin was isolated near the docking pod, but the capsule continues with the docking procedure. Miranda informs David that since all three firewalls, the box, lab and station, were breached, the Soyuz capsule was part of a fail-safe plan to push the station into deep space. Sho, being separated from the others, is uninformed on Calvin's whereabouts and believes that the docking was part of a rescue mission. He leaves his sleeping pod and heads towards the docking pod, forcing open the capsule's hatch. Meanwhile, Calvin sneaks up and attacks him and the Soyuz crew. This results in a docking breach and causes the capsule to detach and crash into the ISS, killing Sho and the Soyuz pilots. David and Miranda, now the only survivors, realize that the crash has caused them to enter a decaying orbit again. Being aware of the possibility that Calvin could survive the re-entry, David recalls 2 escape pods. He plans to selflessly lure Calvin into one pod and pilot it into deep space, allowing Miranda to escape to Earth in the other pod. David successfully leads Calvin into his pod and launches it into space just as Miranda launches hers. One of the pods hits the surrounding debris and is knocked off course. Calvin attacks David as he struggles to pilot his pod into deep space. The 2 pods separate. The Earthbound pod performs a controlled re-entry and lands in the ocean near a boat with 2 fishermen. As they approach and look into the pod, they see David, who is encased in a web-like substance. Meanwhile, due to damage sustained from hitting the floating debris, Miranda's navigation system malfunctions and fails, and she can only scream helplessly as her pod is sent hurtling into deep space, taking her to a lonely and inevitable death. David, still alive, tries to warn the unwitting fishermen not to attempt a rescue. The fishermen open the pod door as 2 other fishing boats arrive. Hope you have enjoyed watching this video. Please do like and subscribe for more.